So today I'm delighted to be talking to Dr. Catherine Walker, social scientist, geographer and academic track fellow at Newcastle University. Hello, Catherine.
Hi, Meryl. It's really great to see you. I first encountered the Ministry of Eco Education at WOMAD Festival, and I was really super excited to hear what was going on. So yeah, really great to be part of this.
It was great to see you at the Ministry of Eco Education Eco Ed event in Newcastle. What did you think about it?
So for me, it was really exciting and invigorating to be in the room with a whole group of teachers and educators working at different stages of the education system and in different contexts, some of them in formal school education, some of them more informally. To be in that room with all those educators getting excited about eco-education and about meaningful, transformational eco-education was super exciting.
So let's talk a little bit about you and your research.
Okay.
You explore global and intergenerational perspectives on youth, climate and environment. How did your journey lead you to focus on this?
I started researching this topic of global and intergenerational responses to environmental issues with my PhD in 2011. And I was looking at how families in different contexts talk about the things that concern them about the environment, from the immediately local to the global, which obviously increasingly means talking about climate change. And as a journey through the PhD, well, kind of my starting point and one that I kept coming back to was this idea of children as agents of change within families, but also within the wider societies that they're part of. I'm really, really interested. I remain really interested in this idea of children as agents of change. There's a lot that I really like about it, but that idea can be used quite uncritically with this idea that we teach a child how to recycle properly, or we teach them to turn lights off and they go home and they nag their parents to do things differently, and that's how we change society, from households outwards. And there is some truth to that, but that idea often can put quite a bit of pressure on young people, and it doesn't take into account the power structures at play within the household, or the dynamics of power within the household, and more importantly, doesn't take into account the wider power structures at play. So I was approaching this quite critically, as I needed to, as a critical social scientist, I guess, doing a PhD. But I was also really, really struck in all of the interviews I did. And as I say, they were in different contexts. So I was researching with families in India, in Hyderabad, and in rural Andhra Pradesh, and in London, and in the southeast of England, and with different socioeconomic backgrounds and resources and things like that. But in all of these families, whatever their socioeconomic and kind of global positioning, one common thing was that the generations were learning from one another, and they were inspiring and influencing one another to care about environmental issues. Frequently, parents were saying the reason that we're doing this is for our children. We want a better world for our children. And our child is kind of constantly telling us that this is important to them. But then also the young people were saying, the reason that I know about this is because my dad tells me this, or my grandmother tells me this. So I could really see how different generations were influencing one another. So, and I could then relate that to my own situation growing up, in my household, we did talk a lot about the environment, and that's had a long-term impact on me. And for example, my sister and I went vegetarian at home. My parents followed, but we were doing that in the context of my dad still grows vegetables, and we knew a lot about where our food came from. So families do influence one another, and yes, that looks very different globally, and that's something that I've continued to look at in my ongoing research, which I guess we'll talk about a little bit more as time goes on. But it was that intergenerational kind of negotiation of ideas and understandings, and then how that plays out in different global contexts that really sort of drew me in.
Yeah, no, and that use of the phrase agents of change is actually picked up in the climate and sustainability strategy by DFE. And it's all very well and good saying, oh, young people can become agents of change. But if the bigger powers that play are not making decisions with their interests at heart, young people's interests at heart, we're in it just ends up as a little bit of a mess. Why do you think there's a huge failure to address climate justice in our existing education system?
Wow, I mean, that's a really big question, but a really, really important one, and actually really what I'm thinking about in my research at the moment. Climate justice has come up increasingly in my conversations with young people over the last sort of 5 years, 10 years. And it's coming up more and more in all kinds of places. You know, I think it's really striking that in 2022, in the Working Group 6 adaptation document, as part of the whole set of IPCC documents that came out in 2022, there's the first reference to climate justice in that document. So more and more we're seeing, you know, even scientists talking about this as a justice issue. But I think schools, as you've alluded to there, Meryl, schools have a lot of catching up to do. In my last research project, I asked teachers, not a huge amount of teachers, but I asked all the teachers that I interviewed if they used the term climate justice in their teaching, and none of them had. They were familiar with the term to different degrees, but they'd never really used it in their teaching. And that then played out in how I talked to young people about their understandings of climate justice, that these weren't activist young people. And so that may have been a bit different if I had spoken to activist young people, but these young people were not particularly familiar with the term climate justice. But once they started to think about it, once they started to think about the different dimensions of it, and think not just about the ways that climate justice can help us see the inequalities that are all wrapped up in climate change, but also thinking about climate change as an agenda for change, as a program, as something that we can all get involved in and build a more just response to climate change. This was something that really, really engaged young people. So we really do need to bring it in to how climate change is taught. But to come back to your original question of why is this not happening, I think there's all kinds of reasons, and some of them are practical, some of them are emotional, some of them are political. Until fairly recently, and possibly even still now, there are very few resources on bringing a more justice focused approach to climate change teaching. And I think there are good reasons for that. So practically speaking, there's been a big focus on getting the science right, and that is really, really important. More recently, there's been a big focus on making climate change education quite skills focused. And again, that's really important in terms of resourcing young people for going into green careers in the future. And even that term green careers will probably cease to exist, because all careers will by sort of necessity be green. But so there's been this big focus on the science, there's been this big focus on the skills. But what that can lose sometimes is the human dimensions of climate change and how that looks different across different contexts. And I think that that can actually alienate some young people from thinking about climate change, because it does remain this kind of technical issue. And I think that really by bringing out some of the human dimensions, that then taps into this other big phenomenon that we see talked about a lot, which is climate anxiety and all of the emotions that young people are feeling about climate change. A lot of them, I think, can be sort of delved into in sensitive ways by thinking through the different justice aspects of climate change. So I think it doesn't happen because the focus hasn't always been there, the resourcing certainly hasn't been there, but I think that it's coming, and I think that it will continue to come, that we will be getting more resources on climate justice, because I think that is the way the world is going. Once the IPCC starts talking about climate justice, I think, you know, we can see that there is a bit of a step change here.
Already over the last couple of years, my school's been involved in doing some of the Oxfam using their resources to try and promote climate justice through posters, and then they display some of the posters from different schools in the Houses of Parliament and things like that to try and get this idea across and to promote that. A lot of the reports that I've read recently are saying that there's not enough time for discussion to take part, and that's what, you know, it's not the science, it's not the causes and consequences of climate change, it's the much wider picture. How do we mitigate it? How do we adapt to it? And this idea of climate justice, which is it can seem very invisible from the UK side of things, but it's very, very much paramount in across the global south.
Yeah, so, and I think as well, just kind of thinking again about just why doesn't it happen? I think it's difficult. It's emotionally difficult to think about those things. There's a really fantastic researcher called Audrey Bryan at Dublin City University, who's written this paper on what she calls pedagogy of the implicated, which is thinking about the ways that we are all implicated in climate change in different ways. And it's uncomfortable to think about that. It's uncomfortable to think about our role, especially as global North citizens, in sustaining climate change. And of course, no educator wants to be making their students feel guilty about this, and that should never ever be the focus of climate change education. But it's about thinking about these different starting points, that we are not being affected in a way that, say, children in Bangladesh or in the Maldives are, and just being realistic about that. But that's an emotional thing, and it can be quite guilt-inducing. So I think it really does need some sensitivity in how it's taught on. But on the flip side, I think by engaging with those emotions, I think that we can make this less of a technical issue and more something that young people who already deeply care about this can kind of care about in more practical ways.
Excellent. So just going back to these pedagogies of which pedagogies can educators use to engender climate justice, and how can we empower the young people to become agents of change? Because a lot of students say that they feel powerless, and we really need to empower them to be able to promote that change we need.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think I'm a big fan of non-hierarchical learning, that actually we are all in this together. That teachers obviously do have specialist subject knowledge that we are sharing with students, and that's really, really important. When it comes to an issue like climate change, there's so many unknowns, there's so much uncertainty, and so we are in many ways sort of on a level playing field in terms of talking through the different responses to that. So I think that kind of trying to sort of level the playing field and just being quite honest. I think teachers being quite honest about, this is an issue that can feel quite overwhelming for adults too, even for me as an educator. I think place-based learning, really starting where you are. Climate change can feel very abstract, but actually thinking through, well, what is our environment like here? Mapping hazards and vulnerabilities and risks, and how all of those could be exacerbated if there were to be, a 1.5, a 1.8, 2 degree global temperature rise, etc. So those kinds of actually thinking it through from the local context, and doing that in an action research style way of actually like, let's find this out, rather than the teacher telling the students all this information, like, let's find this out together. And I've got a book chapter that I wrote in this book called Encountering Ideas of Place in Education, with a really fantastic educator in Melbourne called Andrew Vance, and he's a secondary science educator. And he's got this lovely example of measuring trees' diameter, the trunk of the tree's diameter, as part of the science curriculum. And that being a way that the students both get an appreciation for how long the tree has been there by practically physically measuring the diameter, but they're also hugging the tree as they measure its diameter. So he's got some really nice examples that we put in this chapter of starting from the physical place where students are to engage this very abstract concept of climate change.
And putting children in nature is a
Yeah.
fantastic
Oh,
way of doing that. I love the idea of measuring the diameter of a tree, you know, by putting your hands around, getting the circumference, and then
yeah,
that leads to math skills and all sorts of other ways.
yeah, absolutely.
So is a cross-curricular approach important in exploring, you know, this idea of climate justice?
Oh yeah, no, absolutely. I can't really see another way of doing it, to be honest. And I think it's about learning from one another. You know, we really need robust climate science as the foundation, and in terms of just kind of predicting, you know, how things could pan out, predicting different scenarios. But we also need, you know, very practical skills of actually how do we respond to this? So different technologies, IT skills, for example. But then we also need the arts and the humanities to, as I say, kind of both humanize the topic and to help us to develop creative responses that might engage people in ways that a scientific report doesn't. And I think we can all remember being in primary school, high school, especially high school, and having some subjects that we love and some subjects that they don't really engage us at all. And so I think in terms of getting as many students on board with this topic as possible, coming at it from many different perspectives. Hopefully there'll be one perspective that engages them. You know, maybe they're really into art, maybe they're really into music, and they can think about climate change through kind of creative responses. Or maybe they are really into science, and that's fantastic. But yeah, absolutely, cross-curricular approach, I think, is essential.
And talking about the arts, I adore your beautiful book, Young People,
Crossroads
yes. And Climate Education.
Yes, I have my
action and
copy.
action and adaptation around the world, and storytelling is such an important part of education. How does the process of storytelling come about in this research project?
Yeah, thank you. So this resource came from a project called Young People at a Crossroads, and it was conducted with young people of migrant backgrounds living in Manchester and Melbourne. So all of the participants were between 14 and 18, and they had either migrated with their parents from another country to either Manchester or Melbourne, or they were growing up in households where one or more of the parents had migrated. And the reason I wanted to research with this particular group of young people was access to different ideas, different experiences, different knowledge and experiential knowledge about climate change. Really just kind of thinking through what access do, particularly in very multicultural contexts, what access or what knowledge is in the classroom that might be currently getting overlooked. So working with those young people to go to their parents and find out about how parents had experienced different environmental challenges when they were growing up, and whether that was, whether looking back, they saw that as kind of part of climate change. So in this project, the young people were trained to interview one or more parents about their experiences growing up. And often in the course of the interviews, which I sat in on, and it was always an absolute pleasure to sit in on those interviews, parents would tell stories. You know, they tell stories of their lives growing up. They shared memories. Sometimes they were telling stories for the first time, which was really, really lovely to see. And then the young people who'd done those interviews had the option of writing up a reflection from that interview. And there we saw storytelling coming out again in different ways. They all had different ways of going about writing those reflections. Some of them, well, we shared the transcripts of the interviews they'd done with their parent, and some of them took quotes from those interviews and wrote an account in their parent's voice. Others wrote about what had impacted them most in interviewing their parent. One young person put together a really beautiful photo collage and then annotated it with quotes from the interview. So they all kind of told their stories and their parents' stories in different ways, and they made their parents' story their own story, which was really exciting to see. So in this book, we've got 11 original reflections from young people who interviewed their parents.
I love the idea of promoting intergenerational dialogue, you know, if you again then go to the grandparents and where they came from and where they, you know, what their story is and how much change they've seen. I think, you know, things like shifting baselines, it's really difficult for young people to see how much the world has changed in the last, you know, 100 years or so. So climate action is a heavy weight on the shoulders of young people. How can we ensure that young people are supported and not overwhelmed? I mean, dialogue is one aspect, but how else can we do this?
Yeah, really important question. And obviously I said earlier on how that really in many ways valuable, but potentially kind of quite burdensome phrase, agent of change, can be kind of put on young people in different ways. And I think on the one hand, it is an empowering idea to be told, yes, you're an agent of change. You know, no one is too small to make a difference, to reprise, you know, Greta Thunberg's, the title of one of her books. So we do need to be giving that message that, you know, it's not too late and that everybody can contribute to how we build a more just response to climate change. On the other hand, young people can't feel that they are doing this alone. You know, they need to feel supported. They need to feel that the adults in their worlds are taking action and obviously that looks different according to who the adult is. You know, even as adults, we have different access to, you know, decision making, we have different resources, and we're all kind of positioned differently in how we can respond. So I think on the one hand, it's kind of being quite, as I was saying before, that kind of non-hierarchical, you know, that we are in this together and we are we need to find a way through together. But on the other, I think it is about adults stepping up where we need to. And I think it's really striking that the largest global study of climate anxiety to date that's been published, which was lead authored by Caroline Hickman at the University of Bath, and she heads up the Climate Psychology Alliance. In that report, the source of young people's anxiety is not just their concerns about climate change and the way that it is affecting the world, you know, in terms of physical effects and atmospheric effects. Their anxiety is also coming from the fact that people in power know this and are not doing anything, not doing nearly enough about it. So it's that feeling of betrayal, of being let down, is actually contributing to their anxiety. So all of us adults, in whatever position we're in, one thing we can be doing for young people is just listening to their concerns and trying to, in any way that we can, kind of ensure that those voices are heard and that their concerns are taken seriously.
Absolutely. I'm very much with the children in my classroom, wear my green heart on my sleeve. I try and show them that I walk the walk and talk the talk. So in terms of takeaways, is there one thing that educators should read or watch, or can you know, what sort of recommendations could you make?
And I mean, I'm a little bit biased, but read this. No, we have actually genuinely got a whole set of resources, which I think we can put in the notes at the bottom of this video for educators. So we've got this book is free to download, but we've also got this, which is the Educator's Guide to the Creative Book, which has a lot of spark ideas of how to take the material that's in the book and apply it to different topics or across different curriculum areas. And we've got also the same link that has all the resources. We've got we've shared the interview training guides that we used when we were training the young people to interview parents. So if teachers wanted to sort of do that as an action research project, there's some resources there that might help. Outside of this project, though, a book that I have found really helpful is Learning to Live with Climate Change by Blanche Verley, who is an Australian educator, and it's a free to download book. It's available open access. We'll put the link at the bottom. And that is a really nice example of an educator an educator's account of being very honest, very open with their students, and in terms of how they talk about climate change, and really talk through emotions in a sensitive way, and ultimately in a hopeful way, which kind of means going via a whole range of other emotions to get to that place of hope.
Yeah, absolutely. By empowering young people to take climate action, I think I could use the word hope. You know, it's an important, you know, looking forward to the future. We need to have some optimism that things will change. Catherine, it has been an absolute joy to talk to you today. Our conversation has gone on a whole journey and hopefully has given people a lot to think about. Thank you for your time. I'm looking forward to seeing you again. We're both up in the Northeast, so hopefully we'll get to meet up before too long.
Yeah, lovely. I've really enjoyed speaking to you too, Meryl. Thank you for the opportunity. Yeah, always enjoy talking about this stuff.
Excellent. Thank you.